The moment had arrived, though no one had expected it would come so suddenly, so ruthlessly, so publicly. Imagine sitting in a room you thought was safe, a place where family and legacy are meant to protect you, and being told, without warning, that everything you believed about your status, your identity, and your place in history was about to vanish. Prince Harry had walked into that room just hours ago, expecting a routine discussion about the monarchy, maybe some minor logistics about his charity work, perhaps even a gentle reminder of the importance of public perception. But what he faced instead left him staggered, his mind reeling, and his heart pounding in a rhythm that felt like a countdown to some impending doom. King Charles, the very father who had once guided him through boyhood fears and royal expectations, had just spoken words that would redefine everything. The Duke of Sussex was no more. In its place, Earl of Dumbarton. The shock alone could have broken most people. But Harry? He stood frozen, speechless, and yet every nerve in his body screamed at him that nothing would ever be the same again. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. The story isn't just about a title. It's about power, legacy, betrayal, and the fragile threads that hold a royal family together when every glance, every whispered word, every public smile can conceal years of tension. For decades, the British monarchy has been viewed as untouchable, a symbol of stability, tradition, and inherited authority. Titles like Duke of Sussex are more than just labels. They're passports to influence, guardianships over historical institutions, and markers of prestige that can last for generations. To strip someone of that, even subtly, is to strip them of status, of public identity, and of the security that comes from being recognized as one of the highest-ranking royals. And yet, here it was, unfolding before the world in a private room with only a handful of witnesses, and now, thanks to leaks, insiders, and careful reporting, every one of us is witnessing Harry's shock almost as if we were there ourselves. Have you ever had a moment where the ground beneath you seemed to tilt, where everything you believed in suddenly felt like a lie? That is exactly what Harry experienced, and the reasons behind it are far more tangled than a simple father-son dispute. Rumors had swirled for months, long before this fateful meeting, about tensions between Harry and Charles. Whispers about disagreements over media appearances, charity finances, and even Meghan's influence on Harry's decisions had been circulating. But no one imagined that these quiet frictions, buried beneath layers of etiquette and diplomacy, would explode into a situation where the eldest son's authority and judgment would directly redefine the younger son's titles. It wasn't just a demotion. It was a signal. A public, historical, and personal signal that boundaries had been crossed, mistakes had been made, and consequences were unavoidable. The timing was almost cinematic. Weeks after a string of public appearances by the Sussexes, when they had been seemingly navigating their post-royal life with a careful balance of media presence and private retreats, the announcement of this title change struck like a thunderclap. International media scrambled. Headlines shifted overnight. Social media lit up with speculation, memes, and opinion pieces analyzing not just the practical ramifications, but the personal drama. The father-son conflict that had simmered quietly for years and now erupted with the force of a storm. Viewers across the globe paused to process. How could one word, one decree, one phrase, alter the very foundation of someone's identity in the eyes of the world? And yet, that is precisely what had happened. The Duke of Sussex, the title that had once signified power, privilege, and royal recognition, had been stripped away and replaced with a title far less known, far less prestigious, and yet oddly poetic in its newness: Earl of Dumbarton. The emotional stakes cannot be overstated. Harry had not just inherited a title. He had inherited expectations, responsibilities, and a legacy intertwined with his late mother's memory, his father's guidance, and a public that scrutinizes every decision. Every charitable endeavor, every appearance, every word spoken at a gala or interview has been measured against an almost impossible standard. And now, to see that all that careful navigation of a life in the public eye could be overshadowed by a single meeting, a single decision, is the kind of shock most people would find unbearable. The pain of demotion is both private and public. Privately, it shreds confidence and loyalty. Publicly, It reshapes how the world sees you, whether you are ready or not. But what exactly happened in that room? Who else was present? How did Meghan react when Harry called her after the announcement? There are whispers that this was no spontaneous decision. Some palace insiders suggest it had been in the works for months, carefully strategized to occur when Harry was at a peak of vulnerability. Others insist it was impulsive, an emotional reaction from King Charles himself, fueled by frustration, disappointment, or perhaps a desire to assert authority that he felt had been challenged. Either way, the results are undeniable. Harry was left shocked, and the monarchy faced a ripple effect that is only beginning to show its full magnitude. This story matters now more than ever because we are not just witnessing a private family dispute. We are witnessing history in motion. The line of succession, the distribution of royal duties, and the public perception of the monarchy are all in flux. Even small changes in title can cascade into legal, social, and financial consequences, not to mention the way the public perceives loyalty, power, and respect within the royal household. And yet, despite the gravity of this moment, there is a twist. The new title, Earl of Dumbarton, is not merely a placeholder. There are historical connotations, financial nuances, and perhaps even a hidden message embedded within the selection of that particular earldom. The choice was deliberate, and insiders claim it carries more meaning than the casual observer could ever appreciate. Some say it's an insult masked as a gift. Others insist it is a signal that Harry is being carefully maneuvered into a role that will test his patience, resilience, and strategy. The layers of intrigue are endless. Who leaked the news to the press first? Was it an insider loyal to Charles, or someone seeking to manipulate public perception? How did the public respond? Within hours, memes began circulating online, some mocking, some sympathetic. Royal commentators were scrambling to analyze every historical precedent. Experts dissected the language of the announcement, the phrasing used by the king, and the timing of the decree. Even casual observers were drawn into the drama, asking themselves, how would I react if everything I thought I had was suddenly redefined by someone I trusted implicitly? And perhaps the most important question of all lingers like a shadow over the entire monarchy. Can family loyalty survive when tradition, protocol, and personal grievances collide with such force? If you think this is just about a title, think again. This is about perception, about influence, about power being redistributed in ways that can ripple through generations. Every member of the royal family has been forced to reassess their own positions. Allies and advisors are weighing the implications for themselves. The Sussex's supporters abroad are analyzing whether this will change public support or simply escalate tensions. Meanwhile, the palace itself faces a delicate balance. Maintain order, protect the image of the monarchy, and prevent further leaks, all while navigating the emotional fallout that comes with demoting a beloved son in such a visible, high-stakes way. And yet, even amidst all this turmoil, one question persists. What will Harry do next? Will he accept the change quietly, retreating into a private life with Meghan, or will he respond in ways that could ignite further scandal, media frenzy, and possibly even political repercussions? Some sources suggest he is already drafting a response, carefully considering every word for its impact both legally and publicly. Others claim he is too stunned to act, waiting to process the full gravity of the situation. And that uncertainty, that suspended moment before a major decision, is exactly what makes this story so compelling. Because while titles can be stripped and status can be reassigned, human emotion cannot be so easily controlled. Pride, betrayal, love, and anger are all elements in play, and the combination of those forces in a man like Harry is a powder keg waiting to ignite. By the time the news of his new title, Earl of Dumbarton, reached the press, it had already begun to reshape public conversations about the monarchy, family loyalty, and the very nature of inherited power. Analysts debated what this would mean for Harry's charitable endeavors, his international influence, and his place in history. Social media buzzed with speculation, sympathy, outrage, and mockery. Every meme, every tweet, every news headline reinforced a simple truth. This was not just a change in title. It was a seismic event, one that would define Harry's public and private life for years to come. And still, despite all the facts, the leaked conversations, the expert commentary, and the viral clips, one critical element remains a mystery. What exactly was said in that meeting, face to face, between father and son? What words cut the deepest? How much of it was official protocol, and how much was raw emotion spilling into the halls of history? Insiders remain tight-lipped, but the implications are impossible to ignore. Every gesture, every pause, every carefully chosen phrase carries weight beyond what most of us could imagine. And as we prepare to dive deeper into this story, to unpack the events, reactions, and consequences chapter by chapter, one thing is clear: this is more than a title change. This is a drama that will echo across royal history, media narratives, and personal relationships for years to come. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The air in the room was thick with anticipation, though on the surface, everything seemed calm. Prince Harry entered the private office, a room steeped in decades of history, adorned with portraits of past monarchs, and lined with the weight of expectation. The carpet muffled his footsteps, yet each step echoed in his mind like a warning he wasn't ready to hear. He had been summoned, formally, to meet his father, King Charles, for what had been described as a routine discussion. Perhaps a minor review of royal engagements, a quick update on charitable work, or even a conversation about media appearances. That was the expectation. That was the preparation. What Harry didn't know was that the room was about to become a crucible, forging a moment of shock and disbelief that would ripple far beyond the palace walls. The door closed behind him with a soft, almost ceremonial click, sealing him into an environment where words could cut sharper than swords and silence carried more weight than 1,000 public speeches. King Charles sat behind a polished desk, his posture impeccable, but his eyes betrayed a hint of tension, a flicker of calculation. Advisors lingered at the edges of the room, their expressions carefully neutral, trained to conceal any hint of allegiance or emotion. But even the most practiced courtiers couldn't completely mask the undercurrent of anticipation. They knew, perhaps better than Harry did, that this meeting was unprecedented, that it was a pivotal turning point, that a line was about to be crossed. Harry's initial greeting was polite, formal, almost ceremonial, yet there was a nervous tension in his body he couldn't shake. This wasn't just another family meeting. It carried the weight of history, tradition, and expectation. Every movement, every word, every pause would be scrutinized, analyzed, and remembered. For Harry, who had spent much of his life navigating the complex labyrinth of royal protocol while also attempting to assert his individuality, this was an environment both familiar and suffocating. He was no stranger to pressure, but the mixture of paternal authority and institutional gravity created a pressure unlike any he had experienced before. He had faced the world's media, hostile interviews, and the relentless gaze of public opinion. But this was intimate, personal, and infinitely more disorienting. King Charles began the conversation with measured words, soft but deliberate. On the surface, he spoke of responsibilities, family expectations, and the delicate balance of personal desire versus public duty. He mentioned charitable obligations, the importance of maintaining the monarchy's image, and the subtle dance of appearances and influence. Harry nodded, listening, absorbing the familiar themes, believing he was prepared to respond with the grace and diplomacy that had been drilled into him since childhood. Yet, there was a subtle shift in tone, a slight inflection, that Harry caught instinctively, one that suggested this meeting was anything but routine. It wasn't a discussion, it was a prelude. And what came next would shatter his expectations completely. Then the words came. Not harshly, not with anger, but with an authority that brooked no argument. The Duke of Sussex title would no longer be his. In its place, he would be known as the Earl of Dumbarton. Harry froze, his mind struggling to process the words. There was no immediate explanation, no preamble, just a statement that carried the weight of irrevocable change. He could feel the blood drain from his face, a cold shock traveling through his veins, as if every word had struck him physically. His body reacted before his mind could catch up, muscles tense, jaw tight, heart racing, and a confusion that was almost painful in its intensity. For a moment, the room seemed to shrink, the portraits on the wall bearing silent witness to the unfolding drama. He looked at his father, searching for an expression, a clue, a hint of jest, but found none. King Charles's face was calm, composed, but impenetrable, as though the decision had been weighed for years, and any further discussion was superfluous. The advisors maintained their professional poise, but their eyes flickered occasionally, betraying the tension that hung over the space like a storm cloud. Harry's mind raced. Why now? Why this title? Was this a reaction to something he had done? Something Meghan had influenced? Or was it simply a calculated move to reassert authority, a reminder that no one, not even a son, is untouchable within the monarchy? As the seconds stretched into an eternity, Harry struggled to respond. He opened his mouth to speak, to question, to argue, but the words felt heavy, awkward, trapped between loyalty and incredulity. There was a sense of disbelief that not even his years of royal training could prepare him for. Losing a title was more than symbolic. It was a redefinition of identity, an alteration of public perception, and a blow to the very concept of legacy. The Duke of Sussex was a title tied to his mother's memory, to his father's guidance, and to the public persona he had cultivated over years of visibility. And now, in a matter of moments, it was being stripped away, replaced with a name he had scarcely heard before, one that carried far less recognition and prestige. Harry's thoughts drifted for a moment. Was this about perception, punishment, or both? Every royal knows that titles carry influence beyond the ceremonial. They shape access, control public narratives, and command a certain deference from both the public and peers. Losing the Duke of Sussex title didn't just change how he was addressed in public. It altered his role in the monarchy, his standing in charitable networks, and potentially even the legal and financial privileges that had long been attached to it. The Earl of Dumbarton, while historically significant, lacked the visibility, weight, and emotional resonance of his previous title. The distinction was subtle to an outsider, but to someone living inside the intricate machinery of royalty, it was seismic. Harry's gaze shifted toward his father again, searching for justification, for reasoning, for some explanation that could soften the blow. But King Charles's calm remained impenetrable. He spoke further, outlining the official reasoning, citing tradition, precedent, and the subtle obligations that come with inherited privilege. Yet, the words sounded hollow to Harry, as if the rules themselves had been weaponized, turned into a mechanism of control. There was no warmth, no acknowledgement of personal feelings, no recognition of the decades-long bond between father and son. Just a formal, calculated reassignment of identity, a sentence delivered with regal precision. The tension in the room was almost unbearable. Advisors shuffled papers quietly, avoiding eye contact, aware that any gesture could escalate the situation or reveal bias. Harry's pulse quickened, each beat echoing like a drum in the cavernous office. There was a profound sense of isolation, a sudden awareness that despite the presence of familiar faces, he was navigating the emotional landscape alone. He could feel the weight of history pressing down on him, the invisible eyes of ancestors, courtiers, and public opinion scrutinizing his every reaction. This was more than a personal moment. It was a public spectacle and microcosm, witnessed only by a handful, but destined to become the center of global attention. Then came the moment Harry realized the implications fully. This wasn't a temporary adjustment or a minor rebranding. This was a statement that authority, influence, and recognition within the royal family could be revoked at a moment's notice, that loyalty and service did not guarantee preservation of status, and that even the closest bonds were subject to political and personal calculus. There was a sting of betrayal, sharp and immediate, but also a seed of determination. Harry understood, in that instant, that the path forward would require not just emotional resilience, but strategic thinking, careful public engagement, and perhaps a readiness for confrontation. He attempted to respond, to articulate his disbelief, but the words faltered. How do you question the very institution that raised you, that defined your public identity, without risking further alienation or escalating conflict? How do you reconcile the personal pain of perceived betrayal with the necessity of maintaining composure in a room where every nuance is recorded in memory and scrutinized in context? Harry's training had prepared him for diplomacy, for public appearances, for handling crises. but not for this raw, intimate moment where the machinery of royalty collided with family ties. As the meeting drew toward its formal close, the room held an almost unbearable tension. No one spoke, each person aware that the next words, the slightest gesture, could determine how the narrative unfolded. Harry's mind raced through every possible response, every scenario, every implication of the title change. He knew that once he left this room, the world would soon be watching, waiting for a statement, a reaction, a sign of how he intended to navigate this seismic shift. And yet, in that room, in those final moments before he was allowed to depart, there was a silent understanding between father and son. This was not the end of the story. Far from it. It was merely the opening chapter of a drama that would unfold over months, years, and perhaps even generations. And then, just as he rose to leave, King Charles leaned forward slightly, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement that carried more weight than a declaration. The words he spoke next were calm, controlled, but the implications were anything but. Be mindful, Harry. Titles can change, but choices echo forever. It was a warning, a subtle reminder, and a psychological jolt all at once. Harry left the room with his mind spinning, a whirlwind of shock, anger, and uncertainty. Outside the door, he paused for a single, drawn-out breath, realizing that nothing would ever be the same again. But what came next? The media storm, the family reactions, and the global scrutiny would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Duke of Sussex no longer applies to you. Those words echoed in Harry's mind like a hammer striking glass. Each repetition shattered the sense of identity he had carried for years, leaving a void where confidence, pride, and public stature once stood. He had known his title carried weight, not just legally, but emotionally, historically, and socially. But to hear it revoked in a calm, measured voice, with the casual precision of a line in an official document, was devastating. Titles in the British monarchy are not mere names. They are symbols, vessels of influence and responsibility, badges of trust bestowed across generations. To remove a title is to rewrite one's standing, both publicly and privately. And yet, Harry now faced a reality where his place in the royal hierarchy had been subtly, irrevocably altered. The Duke of Sussex had represented more than status. It was intertwined with his identity. Since childhood, Harry had grown up with the understanding that he would navigate the world with that designation attached, that the weight of history would protect him, and that, despite occasional scandals or media scrutiny, the title would remain his. It was a lineage, a legacy, and a connection to his mother, Princess Diana, whose memory was inseparable from his own royal journey. Now, it was being replaced with something almost unfamiliar, Earl of Dumbarton. On paper, it was not insignificant. The earldom carried history, prestige, and its own place in the tapestry of British nobility, but compared to the globally recognized Duke of Sussex, it felt like a downgrade, a subtle erasure of authority and influence. Every detail mattered. The choice of Dumbarton was deliberate, and insiders would later suggest that it was loaded with layered meaning. Historically, the earldom had significance, yes, but it lacked the resonance, the emotional connection, and the public recognition that Sussex commanded. It was a title that few outside royal circles could immediately contextualize, let alone appreciate. To the casual observer, it might appear as a quaint alternative, a nod to history. But to someone living inside the machine of royalty, steeped in the nuances of status and hierarchy, the shift represented a calculated diminishment, a statement that power and privilege could be reassigned at will. Harry's mind reeled as he considered the implications. The title of Duke had allowed him not just access but influence. He had been able to command media attention, lead charitable endeavors, and shape public perception with a weight unmatched by many of his peers. Dukedoms carry the power to open doors, to signify authority in ways both subtle and overt. They are invitations to networks, endorsements of credibility, and markers of a particular station within one of the world's most visible royal families. An earldom, while prestigious in its own right, did not command the same gravitas, and certainly not the same global attention. Harry was not merely losing a name. He was losing a key to the corridors of influence he had long navigated with care, charisma, and a deep understanding of public expectation. But it wasn't just about prestige. Titles also carry legal and financial weight. Dukedoms are often associated with estates, patronages, and ceremonial duties that provide not just recognition but tangible influence. While the specifics of Harry's holdings had always been carefully managed and sometimes contested, the Duke of Sussex title conferred leverage in ways that the Earl of Dumbarton would not. It affected how he could act in charitable arenas, how he could position himself in negotiations with the media, and even how he would be perceived in legal matters tied to royal obligations. The change was subtle in official records, but seismic in practical terms. It reshaped the playing field entirely. Consider the symbolism. Public perception is everything in the monarchy, and the difference between a duke and an earl is a visual cue that carries immense power. A Duke of Sussex is commanding, recognized, and historic. An Earl of Dumbarton is more obscure, almost quaint, and far less impactful in public consciousness. It is a redefinition of stature, a recalibration of influence, and a public signal that one's position is neither permanent nor guaranteed. In Harry's world, where every appearance, every interview, and every public initiative is dissected for meaning, the loss of the Duke title carried consequences far beyond what a casual observer could measure. The emotional weight was immediate. Harry felt an almost visceral reaction, a mix of disbelief, anger, and a profound sense of personal betrayal. It was not just the loss of a label. It was the erasure of a symbol that had defined much of his adult life. Titles in the royal family are not ceremonial. They are woven into identity, legacy, and even self-perception. To lose a title is to confront the fragility of reputation, the impermanence of public favor, and the painful reality that familial love does not always translate into institutional security. He had navigated scandals, public scrutiny, and media attacks before, but none had prepared him for the subtle brutality of a title reassignment in a quiet room, far from the cameras, yet destined to reverberate across the world. And yet, as the initial shock subsided, questions began to emerge. Why now? Was this a reaction to recent events, past missteps, or an assertion of authority from King Charles himself? Did it have anything to do with Meghan, with media appearances, or with the perceived divergence from royal expectations? Advisors whispered, memos circulated, and palace insiders speculated endlessly. Some claimed this had been planned for months, a deliberate recalibration of titles timed to coincide with public appearances to maximize visibility of the shift without overt confrontation. Others argued it was an impulsive move, born from frustration, disappointment, or even personal offense. Whatever the reasoning, the result was clear. Harry's identity within the monarchy had been formally altered, and he would have to navigate the consequences carefully. Public reaction, when it inevitably arrived, would amplify the impact exponentially. While the meeting was private, information leaked quickly, as it always does in the age of instant communication. Social media would erupt with speculation, tabloids would dissect every nuance of the decision, and royal commentators would debate the historical precedents, the symbolic implications, and the personal ramifications. Every headline, every viral clip, every meme would reinforce the reality that Harry was no longer the Duke of Sussex. The public spectacle would make private shock even more painful, compounding the emotional turbulence with external scrutiny. The layers of complexity extend beyond titles and prestige. Consider the familial dimension. Losing a title is also a subtle assertion of hierarchy and control. King Charles was signaling not just a redistribution of formal status, but a reassertion of authority within the family structure. It was a reminder that even a son, even one who had endured personal and public trials with resilience, was not immune to institutional recalibration. The message was clear. Tradition, protocol, and authority could override personal loyalty and emotional bonds. And in the royal ecosystem, where perception, hierarchy, and historical continuity are sacrosanct, this recalibration carried implications that were as much psychological as they were administrative. Harry, understanding all of this, felt the weight of isolation. Even allies, well-meaning as they might be, could only offer sympathy, not reversal. The decision was irreversible in practical terms, and the room itself, steeped in history, reminded him of the permanence of monarchy structures. There was no undoing what had been pronounced. There was only adaptation, strategy, and careful navigation of the fallout. And yet, even amidst this realization, an ember of defiance flickered within him. A question, perhaps, of whether influence and legacy could truly be diminished by a simple label. As he left the room, the title change burned in his mind. Duke of Sussex had been replaced, but the emotional implications, the legal and social consequences, and the global visibility of the decision would unfold over months. Each day would bring questions, challenges, and moments of scrutiny, each demanding that Harry navigate his new identity with both grace and strategy. And while the initial shock was visceral, the awareness that this was only the beginning. A pivot point in a far larger story settled in with an almost unbearable weight, because the implications didn't stop at the title. Beyond the official announcement, beyond the historical context, beyond the legal nuances, there was the emotional and relational fallout. Meghan's reaction, Harry's private contemplation, sibling rivalry, advisor speculation, and the public's judgment. The ripples of one phrase, one carefully chosen, strategically delivered phrase, had begun to spread in every direction, touching every aspect of life within and outside the palace. And then, just as Harry tried to gather himself, a subtle but pointed detail emerged. Whispers suggested that the decision might not be the final word. There were hints, barely perceptible, that more changes, more reassessments, and possibly more public revelations could follow, depending on Harry's response, Meghan's decisions, and the perception of the public and press. The room had been only the first act. The drama was far from over. What Harry didn't yet know, and what the world would soon discover, was that the loss of his Duke title was only the surface layer of a far deeper, more intricate drama, one that involved strategy, media manipulation, and family dynamics that few outsiders could fully comprehend. And as he prepared to face the outside world with this new title, Earl of Dumbarton, he had no idea that the storm he had just entered would test every aspect of his public persona, private resilience, and personal relationships in ways he had never imagined. Because while the title may have changed, the consequences, the emotional, political, and public consequences, were only beginning to unfold. And what came next would shock not just Harry, but everyone watching. The palace, though centuries old, felt suddenly brittle to Harry as he processed the weight of the title change. Outside the private room where the announcement had been made, hallways that once seemed stately and secure now radiated tension. Every footstep echoed with the possibility of confrontation. Every whisper carried the risk of exposure. But perhaps the most unsettling reality for Harry wasn't the formal reassignment of a title. It was the immediate, invisible shockwave that had begun radiating through his family. The loss of the Duke of Sussex title wasn't just an administrative adjustment. It was a seismic event within a tightly knit, image-conscious network that valued tradition, hierarchy, and loyalty above all else. And as the ripples reached Meghan, Prince William, Catherine, and even more distant relatives, the consequences were anything but predictable. Meghan Markle, in particular, was hit with a mixture of disbelief and frustration. Sources suggest that the Duchess had been anticipating tension over protocol, but she could not have foreseen the suddenness or decisiveness of the move. The reports indicate that her initial reaction was silence, a pause pregnant with intensity, as she processed the news. Even seasoned palace staff, who had long grown accustomed to Meghan's composed exterior, were reportedly stunned at the shift in her energy. Her eyes darkened, jaw set, and a calculated intensity settled over her face. Every gesture, every subtle twitch, seemed to signal both resolve and indignation, a combination that suggested she would respond strategically rather than emotionally. Yet, even she could not ignore the sting of watching her husband, who had invested years of effort into carving out a role both meaningful and visible, suddenly stripped of his most recognizable symbol of power. Meanwhile, Prince William, ever the meticulous observer, registered the move with an almost clinical curiosity. As Harry's elder brother, and by law, next in line for the throne, William had long understood the delicate balance between familial loyalty and royal duty. But even he was reportedly surprised by the timing and severity of the announcement. He knew the implications, both political and emotional. To see his brother's title reassigned in this manner meant that Harry's influence, his public persona, and even his sense of identity were shifting in ways that could have lasting ramifications. Behind the calm exterior, William is said to have analyzed every possible reaction, how this would affect public opinion, the global media narrative, and, crucially, the dynamic between the Sussexes and the rest of the family. The shockwaves didn't stop there. Catherine, too, felt the impact, though it manifested differently. Reports indicate that the Duchess of Cambridge, ever the diplomat, was caught between her role as mediator and her responsibility to the family's public image. She is said to have been quietly observing Harry's reaction, assessing the potential fallout, and preparing herself for the delicate conversations that would inevitably follow. For Catherine, the incident was a reminder of how quickly familial alliances could be tested, and how even a single decision, whether deliberate or impulsive, could ripple through multiple branches of the family tree. The careful balance she had maintained, navigating between support for her husband and maintaining a public image of unity, was suddenly threatened. Every gesture, every word in the coming days, would carry implications that could either stabilize or further inflame the family dynamic. As the news leaked, whether intentionally or through inadvertent channels, the extended royal network began to react. Cousins, advisors, and distant relatives reportedly took sides, weighed their loyalties, and contemplated how the shift would affect their own positions. Some were sympathetic to Harry, recognizing the personal injustice of the demotion. Others aligned with the reasoning behind the decision, interpreting it as a necessary correction, a reinforcement of hierarchy, or a strategic move to protect the monarchy's image. The mixture of loyalty and calculation created an invisible battlefield, one where alliances were as crucial as appearances, and every decision was scrutinized for its potential impact on both public perception and private relationships. Emotional tension within the family was palpable. Observers report that even casual interactions became charged with significance. A raised eyebrow, a delayed response, or a moment of hesitation in conversation could be interpreted as criticism or support, depending on context. For Harry, each interaction became a test, a minefield of subtle signals and loaded gestures. The psychological weight of navigating this environment, already amplified by the shock of losing his title, intensified the emotional strain. Every smile was measured, every tone scrutinized, every glance assessed for hidden meaning. It was a scenario where even silence carried power, and every word spoken could inadvertently tip the balance of perception and influence. Insiders suggest that Meghan immediately began strategizing, not just about how to support Harry emotionally, but how to respond publicly and privately to the implications of his new status. The Duke's, or rather, the Earl's, network of charitable affiliations, patronages, and media engagements would now require delicate recalibration. Every interview, every appearance, every charitable initiative was subject to re-evaluation under this new title, and Meghan reportedly recognized that this was a critical juncture. Her role, already carefully balanced between advocacy and diplomacy, now carried even greater significance. One misstep could amplify the perception of weakness or loss, while a well-timed action could reinforce resilience and authority. Meanwhile, Harry himself struggled to reconcile his personal feelings with the expectations placed upon him. The loss of the Duke of Sussex title was not just a professional setback. It was deeply personal, touching on pride, legacy, and his sense of self. It was a moment that forced reflection. How much of his identity had been intertwined with external validation, public recognition, and familial approval? Could he separate himself from the weight of history, or would the emotional reverberations of this decision continue to haunt him? Reports indicate that in the immediate aftermath, Harry spent hours in solitude, processing the shock, replaying conversations in his mind, and considering the broader implications. It was a period of internal reckoning, punctuated by moments of anger, frustration, and a simmering determination to chart his own path. The family's reaction was further complicated by the presence of loyalists and advisors who played subtle, influential roles behind the scenes. Courtiers, aides, and legal advisors reportedly weighed in quietly, offering interpretations, suggestions, and warnings. Some encouraged restraint, emphasizing the importance of composure and strategic patience. Others were more forthright, highlighting the potential for public backlash or media misinterpretation. The interplay between personal emotion and institutional guidance created a tension that was almost unbearable, as every action or inaction carried consequences beyond what could be immediately measured. And yet, even amidst this emotional turbulence, there were moments of unexpected clarity. Observers report that Harry, despite his shock, began to recognize patterns, subtle cues, and long-standing dynamics that had shaped this outcome. He realized that familial loyalty is often intertwined with power, that public perception can outweigh private relationships, and that the monarchy operates not just on affection or obligation, but on calculated management of influence, image, and historical continuity. This insight, though sobering, also sparked a quiet determination. Harry understood that navigating this shift would require not just emotional resilience, but strategic acumen, public awareness, and careful timing. As the hours turned into days, the ripple effects continued. Conversations in private chambers, whispered discussions in hallways, and the careful choreography of appearances all reflected the ongoing recalibration within the family. Loyalty, once assumed, was now conditional. Trust, once implicit, was being tested. The loss of the Duke of Sussex title had become more than a momentary shock. It was the catalyst for a broader reassessment of relationships, alliances, and influence. Every interaction was now part of a complex equation, one where the stakes were higher than any single title, and the outcomes could resonate for years. The ultimate tension lay not in the public narrative, but in the private dynamic, the subtle, powerful, and unpredictable ways in which Harry and his family would respond to one another. How would Charles navigate his role as father while maintaining authority as king? How would William balance familial loyalty with institutional responsibility? How would Meghan continue to support Harry while asserting her own agency and influence? And, most importantly, how would Harry himself choose to respond? Passively, strategically, or with calculated defiance? The answers would define not just the next chapter of his life, but the trajectory of the monarchy itself. And just when it seemed the family shockwaves might settle, an unexpected development occurred. A brief, leaked conversation suggested that an influential advisor had already begun plotting media responses and public framing, setting the stage for a narrative that would either solidify or further destabilize Harry's position. The palace, though composed externally, was quietly bracing for a storm that no one could fully predict. Because this was not merely a title change, and it was not simply a familial disagreement. It was a recalibration of power, influence, and perception. One that would challenge loyalties, redefine identities, and force the family to confront the fragile balance between tradition and emotion. And the question that now lingered, like a shadow over every interaction, was inevitable. What would Harry do next? The answer would not reveal itself immediately, and what came next would shock not just the family, but the world watching every move. The moment Harry left the private office, the quiet corridors of the palace were only the beginning of a storm that would erupt far beyond its walls. News of the Duke of Sussex being stripped of his title and reassigned as the Earl of Dumbarton leaked faster than anyone could anticipate. Within hours, international headlines blared the announcement, social media buzzed with speculation, and every royal commentator, from seasoned experts to viral TikTok creators, rushed to dissect the seismic implications. The private shock Harry had endured transformed into a public spectacle almost instantly, magnifying the emotional impact and elevating the situation from personal betrayal to global news drama. For Prince Harry, the press storm hit like a physical force. He had navigated media scrutiny before. Of course, every public appearance, interview, and charitable event subjected him to commentary, critique, and analysis. But nothing in his experience compared to the intensity of this moment. This was not a scandal in the traditional sense. It wasn't about a controversial remark or a poorly timed interview. This was an institutional, family-centered upheaval made visible for the world to interpret and judge. The loss of the Duke of Sussex title, previously a private matter confined to palace walls, had now become a narrative with international consequences. The coverage was instantaneous and multifaceted. British tabloids treated it as a shocking family drama, highlighting the father-son tension and speculating on the underlying causes of the demotion. The Guardian, The Times, and the Daily Mail all ran analyses exploring the historical significance of title redistribution, comparing Harry's experience to prior instances in royal history. Across the Atlantic, U.S. media outlets framed the story as yet another twist in the Sussexes' ongoing struggle with royal tradition, emphasizing Meghan Markle's involvement and her perceived influence over Harry's decisions. Headlines ranged from sympathetic, Prince Harry's title stripped, a personal blow, to sensationalist, Earl of Dumbarton, Duke no more, royal scandal unfolds, each amplifying the tension in different ways. Social media added a new layer to the storm. Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok users debated the change with fervor, posting memes, sharing historical comparisons, and even speculating on Harry's next moves. The reaction was polarized. Some defended Harry, framing the loss as unfair, excessive, or cruel. Others sided with the monarchy, interpreting the reassignment as a necessary step to reinforce authority and hierarchy. The intensity of online engagement created a feedback loop, with journalists and commentators responding in real time to viral posts, further blurring the lines between private family matters and global spectacle. The speed at which information traveled only heightened the stakes. Within minutes of the first leaks, palace aides were scrambling to manage both the factual accuracy of reports and the emotional fallout. Statements were drafted and revised, some sent to journalists, others quietly circulated to trusted media contacts. Every nuance of language mattered. A misplaced word could be interpreted as criticism, anger, or public defiance. The optics of the story, the framing of Harry as a victim, a rebel, or a disgraced royal, were just as significant as the facts themselves. The palace understood that perception could outweigh reality, and in a situation like this, perception could define history. Harry and Meghan, meanwhile, were forced into a dual role, processing personal shock while preparing for public response. The Duchess of Sussex reportedly spent hours reviewing potential messaging strategies, carefully weighing every sentence for impact, tone, and long-term consequences. Meanwhile, Harry wrestled with anger, disbelief, and a simmering sense of injustice. Every media mention of his new title, the Earl of Dumbarton, felt like a spotlight highlighting vulnerability, a constant reminder that the world was watching him adjust to a new identity. The combination of private turmoil and public scrutiny created an emotional pressure cooker that few outside the palace could comprehend. The press storm also magnified historical comparisons and expert analysis. Royal historians weighed in, drawing parallels to past cases where titles were reassigned, dukedoms revoked, or heirs subtly diminished. They dissected the strategic nature of the reassignment, noting that titles are rarely changed arbitrarily. Each carries social, political, and symbolic meaning. The Earl of Dumbarton, while prestigious, lacked the immediate resonance of Sussex, highlighting the calculated nature of the shift. Commentators emphasized that this was as much about signaling loyalty, hierarchy, and power as it was about formality. It wasn't just a family decision, it was a carefully choreographed public narrative. Across Europe, media coverage drew attention to the subtle interplay of history, symbolism, and influence. German, French, and Italian outlets analyzed the move through cultural lenses, discussing how royal titles and lineage carry societal significance beyond the United Kingdom. They noted that stripping a title is more than administrative. It's a statement about identity, status, and belonging. In every corner of the globe, readers and viewers were being invited to consider not just the personal drama, but the larger implications for monarchy, tradition, and the intricate web of royal influence. Within the palace, the internal reactions were no less dramatic. Courtiers and aides watched the media unfold with a mix of anxiety and fascination. Some were tasked with damage control, quietly managing leaks, preparing statements, and monitoring social media chatter. Others were reportedly observing, curious to see how Harry and Meghan would respond, aware that their reaction could influence public perception and potentially shape future royal strategy. Every gesture, every comment, every interview would be scrutinized for signs of dissent, defiance, or reconciliation. The stakes were enormous, not just for Harry personally, but for the monarchy's broader image and credibility. The social dimension of the press storm added another layer of complexity. Public opinion surveys, trending hashtags, and viral discussions created an environment where Harry's every move was analyzed and debated. People debated fairness, familial loyalty, and institutional authority. Supporters rallied behind him, while critics questioned his adherence to tradition and expectations. Each tweet, post, and article created ripples, further complicating the emotional and strategic landscape Harry had to navigate. Even allies and advisors found themselves caught between providing support and managing optics, aware that any misstep could exacerbate the storm. Amid this chaos, the Sussexes' response, or lack thereof, became a story in itself. Reporters speculated on whether Harry would address the reassignment publicly, whether Meghan would issue a statement, and whether any coordinated action might follow. The uncertainty fed speculation, heightening tension and amplifying curiosity. Every media outlet had a stake in the unfolding drama, and the swirling narratives created a sense that the story was evolving in real time, with Harry at the center, caught between personal indignation and public scrutiny. The emotional impact on Harry was profound. It wasn't just about losing a title. It was about watching the world interpret, judge, and comment on that loss in real time. Every headline was a reminder of his diminished visibility, every tweet a reflection on his new identity, every article a signal of how deeply the repercussions had spread. He was navigating a personal crisis that had become a global narrative, one that would define him, Meghan, and the perception of their place in the royal hierarchy for years to come. And yet, the press storm was only the beginning. Behind the media coverage, behind the viral memes and headlines, subtle forces were moving. Advisors whispered, strategists plotted, and palace insiders began to maneuver, anticipating the reactions of both family and public. The reassignment of a title was no longer just a symbolic act. It had become a catalyst for power plays, influence battles, and potential strategic realignments within the palace. Harry, caught in the center of this swirling storm, faced not only emotional challenges but strategic dilemmas, every choice scrutinized by history, the media, and family alike. Because while the world debated the significance of Earl of Dumbarton, Harry and Meghan had to contend with the real consequences: how to maintain authority, credibility, and visibility in an environment that had suddenly shifted under their feet. And as the global media frenzy grew, as analysts dissected motives and symbolism, one thing became clear: the storm was far from over. The reassignment of a title had ignited a chain reaction, and what would happen next? Inside the palace and across the world would be unpredictable, intense, and, for Harry, deeply personal. What happened next would redefine how the Sussexes navigated media, family dynamics, and public perception. And the world was about to see how far-reaching the consequences of a single sentence could be. The moment Harry learned he would no longer hold the Duke of Sussex title, the immediate emotional shock was only the beginning. Titles in the British monarchy are more than symbolic. They carry legal weight, financial implications, and operational authority. A title isn't just a name on a letterhead. It is a framework that defines privileges, responsibilities, inheritance rights, and the ability to act within the complex machinery of the monarchy. Losing a dukedom, then, is not just a blow to personal pride. It's a shift in legal and financial status that reverberates across multiple dimensions of life, both public and private. For Harry, the ramifications of this change were vast, immediate, and far more complicated than he could have anticipated. First, the legal consequences of title reassignment are intricate. Dukedoms, like Sussex, are linked to patents granted by the Crown, which are formalized in letters patent. These documents define the rights, privileges, and lineage associated with the title. When a duke loses his title, it can affect everything from the right to use specific ceremonial insignia, to legal recognition in matters of inheritance or patronage. The Earl of Dumbarton title, while historically significant, did not carry the same legal standing in certain contexts. Certain estates, patronages, or ceremonial privileges previously associated with the Sussex dukedom would require reassessment or transfer. In essence, Harry now had to navigate a web of legal intricacies while simultaneously managing the personal and emotional fallout. Every decision he made would need careful consideration to avoid unintentionally undermining his rights or influence. Financial implications were equally critical. Dukedoms are tied, historically and operationally, to certain financial privileges. While Harry's exact financial arrangements have always been private, it's understood that the Duke of Sussex title carried symbolic weight that translated into fundraising opportunities, sponsorships, and media influence. Public perception affects financial leverage. Charities and institutions often weigh the prestige of association with a high-ranking title when seeking endorsements, support, or funding. Losing the Duke title, therefore, could subtly diminish Harry's ability to attract resources for his initiatives, affecting both the reach and perception of his charitable work. Even minor shifts in title visibility can alter negotiations, sponsorship potential, and international recognition, an invisible but potent effect on long-term financial and operational influence. The reassignment also introduced complexity in legal documentation. Official correspondence, contracts, and formal communications that referenced the Duke of Sussex title needed updating. A single oversight, using the outdated title in a public or legal setting, could be leveraged by critics or rivals, further complicating Harry's already delicate situation. Legal advisors reportedly began reviewing all of Harry's current engagements to ensure compliance with the new designation and to mitigate potential disputes. This was not just bureaucracy. It was the careful maintenance of credibility, identity, and authority under a new, less recognized title. Moreover, the shift affected Harry's network of patronages. Dukes often serve as patrons for charitable organizations, arts institutions, and public initiatives. While some patronages are flexible and tied to the individual, others are formally connected to the title itself. Losing the Sussex dukedom risked creating confusion among organizations, potentially diminishing their perceived endorsement, financial support, or legitimacy. Advisors reportedly began preparing strategies to communicate the change to partners, reassure stakeholders, and maintain continuity of influence, but the challenge was enormous. One misstep could not only affect Harry's standing, but also the success and visibility of initiatives he had championed for years. Beyond formal legal and financial structures, the reassignment carried public relations implications. Titles like Duke of Sussex confer immediate recognition and authority in both domestic and international contexts. Losing this high-profile designation made every engagement more complex, as Harry now had to clarify his role, responsibilities, and rank at public events. Media outlets, accustomed to the visibility of Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, would now see him as Earl of Dumbarton, a title far less resonant with audiences worldwide. The loss subtly undermined his global visibility, and in the interconnected media ecosystem, perception is power. This shift would affect negotiations, appearances, and influence in ways that were almost impossible to quantify at the moment, but undeniably real. Family inheritance was another layer of concern. While Harry is far from his father's direct line of inheritance, the reassignment could affect future claims, ceremonial precedents, and the management of estates tied historically to the dukedom. Estates associated with titles often carry privileges, property rights, and ceremonial responsibilities that can impact family dynamics and influence. The reassignment could potentially limit Harry's formal involvement in certain historical trusts, ceremonial duties, or royal responsibilities tied to the Sussex dukedom. These legal nuances, though subtle, compound the sense of displacement and underscore the tangible consequences of what might otherwise appear as a symbolic change. Advisors and courtiers immediately began assessing risk mitigation strategies. Sources report that legal teams were tasked with reviewing Harry's ongoing commitments, contracts, and affiliations to ensure no inconsistencies with his new title. Public communications had to be carefully drafted to preserve his image while explaining the change. Every action, statement, or appearance would now be scrutinized not only for content, but for the implicit signal of status. One poorly phrased comment could be amplified by critics, historians, or media outlets, further complicating the fallout. Harry faced an unprecedented combination of personal and professional challenges that required careful legal, financial, and strategic navigation simultaneously. The media added yet another layer of pressure. Headlines focused on the perceived humiliation of the title change, framing it as a punishment or family betrayal. Analysts debated historical precedent, discussing whether previous reassignments had been handled more subtly or publicly. Social media erupted with speculation, memes, and commentary, amplifying the perception that Harry's influence and authority had been dramatically diminished. Every international news segment, every viral post, and every op-ed contributed to the growing sense that the title reassignment was both a personal blow and a public spectacle. Emotionally, the intersection of legal and financial fallout was overwhelming. Harry had long been conscious of his position within the monarchy, aware that prestige, influence, and legacy are intertwined. Losing the Duke of Sussex title was not just a symbolic gesture. It was a recalibration of power that affected both his external engagements and internal sense of identity. Advisors reportedly noticed his brief moments of anger, frustration, and disbelief, mixed with an analytical assessment of the new circumstances.